Hello, everyone. Welcome to People for Cities. Um, People for Cities is an initiative by CoLab, which is a small design and research collaborative based in Chennai. Um, People for Cities is an initiative through which we hope to engage with more and more sections of society on important issues that we face as citizens of metropolises and other smaller urban conglomerations around the world. So today we will be discussing heritage, but in the past we have discussed public space, the impact of COVID-19, citizen participation in cities, and so on. So this is the fifth webinar from our series, and towards the end of the webinar, I'll let you know how you can probably look at some of our older webinars. So today as I mentioned, we will be talking about built heritage. So this will be divided into roughly two sections. Section one looks at what heritage is, what conservation is. We kind of take it back to the basics to see what are the factors that influence conservation practice in general around the world. But in section two, we look at the role of heritage in society, specifically in the Indian context. So I'm going to be giving a bit more of an Eastern as a subcontinental context from India as an Eastern context, rather than the Western context, which we see a lot in popular discourse everywhere around the world. So that being said, I think we can start. All right. So to start with the basics, we will be looking at what is heritage, what does it mean to conserve heritage, and why we actually carry out this process of conservation. So generally, the term heritage can be applied to both tangible and intangible elements. Tangible elements include built environments such as uh, ancient palaces, whether it's historical mansions of important people, whether it's a particular kind of architecture that is unique to a place, and so on and so forth. Then you have intangible elements like culinary traditions, languages, festivals, local traditions like whether it's lifestyle related elements, whether it's food, whether it's, there are, I'm sure you guys are aware of the different kinds of intangible elements around us as well. So when we talk about conservation, we essentially are talking about the conservation of built historic environments in this context, or in the context of this webinar. So we're looking at essentially how we can safeguard the past from deterioration in the present for the benefit of future generations. Now, why this is necessary is because there is a need to kind of know where we come from and know past events to be able to carry that forward into the future as whether it's lessons, whether it is carrying it as part of our individual identities. There are many reasons, but this is the broadest possible definition of conservation that you can have. So this involves the protection, management, and enhancement sometimes of historical assets that are of significance to certain individuals or certain communities or certain countries. It differs at each scale, but the importance may be slightly more or less depending on the scale. But this is essentially what is conservation. So through this process, we make all these historical relics relevant to contemporary society. We make it accessible to them. We make it so when you conserve a particular heritage monument, it becomes available to them as a tool to look into the past. as opposed to when we do nothing and then we have these historical markers completely vanishing from our societies. So with the approaches to conservation, there, depending on the level of intervention involved, um, there are different levels that you can uh, that you can like different processes that you can employ in the conservation of historical environments. So the first is obviously no intervention at all. We don't do anything in addressing a particular piece of built heritage. The second is that we prevent it from damage and decay by managing the built environment from the beginning. So in this process, if you look at large national monuments, generally these are protected monuments from the beginning. They are taken care of by local governments, by national governments. So there's a lot of importance attached to such structures, and this unfortunately happens very rarely, and only with monuments of great significance. Then you have minor repairs where you have small instances of damage or decay that you need to address, and that those are minor repairs that are taken care of, and then you continue sort of preserving the built environment. Then you have consolidation where you'll have to add certain elements to make sure that your building is, for example, if there is a problem with the structural integrity of the building, then you might need to add a column somewhere to make sure that the building is still standing and is safe for people to use. Then you go into restoration where, say for example, after the world wars, many cities were completely burnt down, and you have many of these buildings which were completely burned down during all these bombing raids. So in those cases, those buildings would have been restored to their original design. If they were completely destroyed, in that case, you would go in for reconstruction, where you kind of build the building back according to the original design with no deviation. Then you have adaptation and reuse, which is there are existing historical buildings, but maybe they're not being considered as historical monuments for preservation as they are. So you kind of try to adapt them and reuse them in different in a different form. So, for example, in India, the most common example of this is where there are ancient palaces in the country which belong to smaller sort of smaller families, smaller royal families, which have now been transformed into hotels or boutiques and such. So now, with this kind of transformation of use or transformation of form of the building with addition of different elements to the building, these could be done in a contrasting or conforming manner, which means that your addition of new elements can either completely conform with the design of the existing structure, or you can try and introduce something that is completely in the opposite direction, which might be more in tune with the architecture of today. So in this case, there are different ways of dealing with adaptive reuse as well. Then you have a relocation of heritage structures. Now, this is not something which happens very commonly, but if for some reason a heritage structure it's not feasible for it to be situated in its original location anymore, it is moved to a different location. Then you have reproduction or replication where, for example, if some structure of importance had been destroyed in the past, it is completely reproduced. These are some of the instances where you kind of deal with conservation. And the final thing is demolition. In this case, you might decide that this particular piece of heritage is no longer relevant or important to a particular community, or it just doesn't make sense to hold on to it because it's not economically feasible and so on. So in this case, people might choose to record the structure maybe, but again, this is a rare case. But you could probably record the structure and then demolish it so that there is at least some kind of documentation about the existence of this structure. So just a quick activity, if you all could switch on your microphones. These are some structures, heritage environments that I've placed here as examples, but you can think of your own examples as well. And tell me why these particular monuments have survived these hundreds of years, despite the fact that human society has evolved so much. Why do these continue to remain important to all of us? Anyone?
Sort of representational of your community, or like a boost to personal economy, or like a community's economy, and something like some instance like that.
Right, a boost to a particular economy. Now, what I mean here is, why would you have chosen to conserve this in the first place? Like, for example, you have the Taj Mahal, which is the most like iconic structure in all of India, debatably so, but yes. Maybe this was important as a symbol of love, which is what it's known as. Maybe it was a symbol of pride of the local artisans who were involved in this, or the ruler who commissioned this. I'm asking, like, what kind of meaning do these structures hold to people that they've managed to survive for so long? You can also sort of refer to your own local context as well.
I think it's also maybe the sheer workmanship of these places. Like if you look at Taj Mahal, like you see the workmanship. It's very intricate. It's to a detail where you don't see in too many buildings of that particular period. Like if you see the Humayun's tomb and other such structures which came along the same time.
Right. Yeah. Sorry, you had something else to say, Tasneem?
No, just that. Just like, I think it's probably the workmanship that sort of keeps it gave it the kind of importance it has now, as compared to the other structures.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I guess with the Stonehenge, it is also because it's such an important specimen of a particular period of time from when we don't have a lot of structures remaining. So it becomes this kind of evidence of a particular lifestyle, of a particular community, which we have no contact with anymore. We don't have any other written or graphic records of.
So it defines that.
Yeah, sort of defines that particular era. Then when you look at something as, elaborate as this opera house, this is the Royal Opera House in London. Now, again, this is an important piece of heritage, not only because, it's this beautiful structure, which it is for sure, but also because this has been a place where, generations after generations have come in and watched maybe theater, maybe ballet, so many things people could have watched here. It's kind of a tradition which passes on as well. And same with the stepwells. It's kind of tied to the local culture, to how people sort of use these spaces and how they've continued to be a part of our heritage, of our culture even today. So with that said, I'm just going to move to the next slide. So why conserve heritage? Like I said, it informs our sense of collective identity. Now, heritage is not necessarily a fixed concept. It's a fluid concept which evolves with time. So a particular piece of heritage might be very important to us today, but maybe 30, 40 years down the line, our children or their children might not identify with it anymore. So they might perish, which is something we've seen in our generations as well. So it's a constantly evolving concept that is impacted by cultural, economic, social, political, and temporal factors. Conservation doesn't necessarily mean uh, the conservation of individual items, but it's the construction and regulation of a set of values and meanings, which means that you're not necessarily conserving a particular building as such. It's the fact that you're connected to that building through some certain values, whether they're aesthetic, whether they are communal values, whether it could be something as simple as taste. A lot of people could like a particular building, and that is why it survives. So these values essentially provide justifications for decisions pertaining to the protection of historic environments. And this is how you decide which building should be conserved and privileged over another building in the same context. So the sense of values, this values-based approach to heritage conservation kind of provides us a list of values according to which different specimens of heritage can be evaluated, and then you can decide that one needs to be preserved and the other is not as important. So this way you kind of add like some kind of worth to each structure, and each structure is also multivalent. Like a particular building might be important to me because it's a beautiful piece of architecture, but it might be important to another person because it has some kind of religious connotations for them, and so on and so forth. So it's not necessarily something that is universally applied. Each person's view, each person's perspective about a particular heritage built environment is going to be completely different from the other. Privileging some element of the past as heritage over another necessarily involves a socially constructed process of selection. So this selection of heritage is something we see, as I said, based on these values. So this is a timeline of different value frameworks that have been proposed over time. Now, what needs to be noted is that there are all these different frameworks, and yet there's not been any particular framework that can be, universally applied, and you can make decisions based on that particular framework. So this lack of universal framework means that the heritage discourse in different countries is completely different to the other places around the world. So, for example, in Western countries, in European countries especially, you see a lot of importance attached to heritage buildings. You see the preservation of, these beautiful medieval structures, which are of importance to the history of the place, but also it has been preserved so well that it has become a part of the contemporary cities as well. Whereas, for example, in India, if I were to look at it, the scenario is completely different. So, if I look at heritage discourse in India, it's handled at different levels by different organizations. There is not one uniform authority or law that applies across all buildings. So there's no clear heritage policy that defines the rules and regulations pertaining to the practice of conservation. So, which means that if I'm based in Chennai, which is my home city, I might be subjected to three different authorities at the city level, from whom I'll have to get permission, and then you have the national level. And so there is like this constant tussle between these agencies, which means that dealing with heritage becomes very strenuous process, and also it is a vague process because it's open to interpretation since there is no proper laws which have been framed for that. So in the case of India, there are 32 World Heritage Sites, and the premier body within India which deals with heritage conservation is the Archaeological Survey of India, or ASI. They operate in the country through 24 circles, and in the case of Chennai, which is in the state of Tamil Nadu, the Chennai circle deals with that. And there are 251 national monuments here and 160 heritage sites. So the reason I'm telling you all this is because I'd like you to have a sense of the kind of hierarchy that exists, and the fact that despite being home to several heritage structures, uh, these are not necessarily governed by any kind of heritage policy, which means that most of these structures do perish very quickly. So, for example, in Chennai, the Tamil Nadu Heritage Act was passed in 2012, which created this body called the Heritage Conservation Committee, but this body hasn't done anything useful as yet. This was introduced in 2012, but we haven't really seen any significant action since then because there is criticism that this body has not hired enough experts or professionals, and that no proper listing process has been carried out, despite the fact that the process has been initiated many times. So this is the state of heritage in a place like India, which is completely different from the European context, where there is a clear sense of the laws and the process in dealing with heritage. So in this case, many people who own these buildings, they don't know what to do with them because there are many building owners who are so skeptical about this process that they either just continue living or using unsafe heritage environments, or they completely abandon those places and essentially just wait for them to fall or burn down, so that they can use that land for other purposes in the future. So when you look at the role of heritage in society, um, despite all of these lapses and lack of clarity in dealing with heritage, there is a lot of um, benefits that can be derived out of proper heritage conservation practice. So when you look at the sustainable development goals, there are 17 of them totally, but I believe that 4 in particular deal with heritage, not directly, but at least heritage can contribute to these 4 goals. So these are good health and well-being, decent work and economic growth, sustainable cities and communities, and partnerships for the goals. So I'm going to go into what these benefits are in the next few slides. So with regards to creating sustainable communities and health and well-being, both of those goals, a sense of place and collective identity is very important. Cultural heritage clearly, as I said before, informs our sense of self, our sense of place where we belong from, and gives people a sense of attachment to each other and the sense of community that is developed through the retention of such structures. This is because heritage addresses the human aspect of the city, contributing towards the inclusion of marginalized communities, thus empowering them to participate in creating wholesome, equitable solutions. So if you look at these two contrasting places, they both are shopping streets. They're both in India. The one on your left is in Chennai, and the one on your right is in Jaipur. Now, most people, if I showed you the image on the right, would be able to tell you that it's Jaipur because of the distinct kind of architectural form and the use of material, which is very unique to this place. but the image on your left can be from anywhere, even if you decipher the fact that it's a Tamil font there, which means that it needs to be somewhere in Tamil Nadu. That's how you make out the buildings as such. The environment as such does not tell you anything about what's going on here, except for the fact that it is a commercial area and on steroids essentially. So it's all about like a consumer driven environment, which means that people are not really interacting with each other or with the environment. And this, like, nobody would tell you that, in my city, this is where I belong from. If you ask people from Jaipur, they will readily tell you about Jori Bazaar as being this beautiful uh, bazaar where many tourists go, and as well as locals who go and do their shopping and things. But on your left, this looks like any shopping street in Chennai, and you might not be able to identify which one. So this is an image from Hong Kong. This is essentially what is happening to most Asian cities in specific. So another thing about Asian cities is that these are the developing cities right now, which means that development happens at a rapid pace, and there is not really any attention being paid to how this development happens. So the uniqueness of urban form is directly proportional to the connectedness between the citizens and the city. So when you have these kind of drab and honestly dull living environments, uh, there is not, it doesn't really encourage you to, interact with others or uh, feel a sense of inspiration or of, motivation in these cities. So, an uninspiring urban form results in a sense of detachment both between citizens and between citizens and the city. In this scenario, we see this happening across a lot of Asian cities, particularly in India, where there is a disenfranchisement from of the public, which means that most people are not involved in public affairs. Um, these poor physical environments also impact, physical and mental well-being of citizens. Um, so, for example, I'm going to show you Chennai. So, this is an area called Georgetown, where vernacular, climate-responsive techniques and materials were once used for construction, like pot tiling, pitch roofs, etc. And spaces like tinnais and mutrams, which are essentially courtyards and verandas, where people used to relax and kind of interact with each other. These were built into the fabric of the city. So these provided some respite from the heat and also allowed people to talk to each other, which means that there is generally a more engaged populace, which are well informed and aware of each other's problems. Now, cut to the present, and this is somewhat the kind of architecture that you will find in Georgetown. So here there is a serious loss of uniqueness in urban form. Now this place is just incredibly crowded. There is no kind of instance where you can interact with another human being on the street, let alone get some respite. In fact, we did a few studies here, and there is a significant homeless population here on the streets, and yet they are not even allowed to uh, rest anywhere in the buildings nearby, and there are no spaces for rest on the street, which means that they suffer through the heat. So what I'm trying to say is this loss and uniqueness of urban form not only affects how you perceive the city, but in a very real way affects how you inhabit the city as well. Because these structures no longer respond to the local context, whether it's climate related or lifestyles. It does not provide it does not accommodate the requirements of the local population. Then you have your economic benefits from the preservation of historic environments. So generally, culturally rich cities are more attractive for businesses because they promote inclusive and sustainable urban economic growth through employment in culture and creativity, which encourages decent work. Which and also having these kind of inspiring and unique built environments means that the workforce, the general population that lives within an area is healthier and more competitive, which means that you have a better workforce, which is more engaged in economic activity. And of course, the existence of such built environments also means that there is a promotion of tourist activity, which also in turn creates many more jobs and provides livelihood to many more people. And in turn, this kind of these places which have booming tourism industries also contribute significantly to their country's GDPs. And finally, there is a very important benefit of heritage that we don't necessarily always associate with it, which is climate resilience. So the Paris Agreement, which in recent times has found a lot of coverage in the news America's because of America pulling out of the Paris Agreement, but it's also known as an important agreement that was made with the goal of addressing climate change at a global level. So this Paris Agreement notes the importance of traditional and indigenous knowledge when thinking about climate adaptation strategies. So the knowledge of historical and vernacular spatial planning practices is a useful resource for how people can respond to local climatic conditions and climate disasters in a better way, because these local technologies and vernacular practices have been evolved over a considerable period of time with respect to the local context, which is not necessarily how most of our cities are built today. So through this kind of process, local artisans and craftsmen also gain employment, because these processes are also incredibly localized, which means that people from the outside can't necessarily come in and carry out those processes. So it also generates income and employment at a local level. So, for example, this is a picture of Majuli, an island located in the middle of the Brahmaputra River in Assam, which is a state in India towards the northeast. So this place is known for a number of monasteries. They have 30 monasteries in the area called satras. And at the same time, because of its unique position, it is also important from a natural heritage perspective. Now, this area has been facing a lot of annual flooding, especially in recent years. Now, these satras, which have been constructed as permanent structures, have in many cases taken a beating during these floods, because they're not necessarily responsive to the local environment, whereas these temporary structures, modular and portable structures, which have been built, have been very successful in combating flooding. So this portability has always been a unique character of the portability of built form has been a unique character of the local architecture. So you kind of see the contrast in how different building practices within the area have responded to the climate context there. So in climate mitigation and climate resilience strategies, such knowledge is very, very important. So with those benefits, I will wrap up the presentation. These are a few references that I've used in creating this presentation. So if you are interested, you can probably find these online and have a look as well. You can always get in touch with me as well at kritika@co-lab.in. If you have any further inputs to share, or if want to initiate some kind of dialogue, not only about the problems associated with heritage, but also in general, any urban affairs. Thank you so much for joining me today, and I hope to see you all again soon.